here is now Ukraine conducting a counteroffensive onto Russian soil itself. He's always said that his war was a special operation to defend Russia, and here he's failed in his role of doing that. So there's a sort of psychological blow to Putin, which will mean his reaction to it is likely to be at the more extreme end of the scale.
Start this afternoon in Ukraine because Volodymyr Zelensky has said Putin's war is coming home to Russia. Ukraine has begun the largest offensive on Russian territory since the war began by launching an attack on the Russian border region of Kursk. And speaking to Times Radio Breakfast, the former Defence Minister James Heappey said no Western government can cheer on Zelensky invading Russia.
Of course, no Western government can cheer on Zelensky invading Russia. That would be nuts.
And yet you think it's clever.
I do. And so will everybody behind the scenes in the UK MOD, the US DOD, French MOD, and everywhere else. Everybody will see the military logic in what Zelensky is doing.
Ukraine is also putting pressure on the UK to let it use British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles in the offensive, but Downing Street are holding strong. In a moment, we'll speak to Colonel Simon Diggins, but let's first speak to Francis Farrell, who is a reporter at the Kyiv Independent. Francis, what is the latest on the ground there?
G'day. Yeah, so it's been about a week into the offensive at this point, and now we're really starting to finally get some clearer information that goes beyond the reports and sporadic photos of Ukrainians here, Ukrainians there, and we don't know where they're actually holding territory, and we don't know where they're going. So, after an initial very rapid and frantic phase of this incursion into Kursk Oblast, we can see that they are holding territory. The Ukrainians themselves said it's about 1,000 square kilometers of territory, and the Russians said it's 28 settlements. So it is within a kind of 10 to 20 mile zone across the border. But at that point, this is the point in the operation where both sides are starting to actually dig trenches, dig positions, and that's what we see at the moment. The one bigger town of Suja, the control of there is still contested and unclear, but we more or less get the idea of the scale now of the whole thing.
And of course, there will be a counteroffensive to the counteroffensive from Russia. What are we expecting there, do you think? What are the Ukrainian people and government expecting and preparing for?
So it's already beginning, obviously. The reason why the offensive was so successful at first was so poorly manned. It was just conscripts and border guards who shouldn't have ever been involved in this kind of fighting. But now, obviously, Russia is adjusting and they're moving in units, combat units, different battalions from the army, from the National Guard. And the big question is what the battles will look like once they really start clashing on a larger scale, and will Ukraine be able to eventually head back as if it was a larger kind of raid. But of course, this is part of the plan from the start. I think most people see that an aim for this operation was, apart from the political aims, was also to draw away Russian units from the east of the country where they're attacking inside Ukrainian territory itself.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Francis Farrell there, who's a reporter at the Kyiv Independent. Well, let's turn now to Colonel Simon Diggins. He's a defence security and military analyst. He's a former British Army officer. He's seen service in lots of different theatres: Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine and West Africa. Simon, there's a few people more qualified to comment on this, and I wonder what you think this will be seen as and how will it be used in the bargaining chip sense, not just in regard to what's happening in Ukraine. But I was interested by the comments from the US State Department being concerned about hundreds of Iranian ballistic missiles that could be transferred to Russia. And I wonder if that might happen, if you think that's likely in the context of the geopolitical situation linking to massive conflicts, which of course have links already, but perhaps you could give us your perspective on that.
Certainly. I mean, on the first things, I agree with what Francis said. I mean, I think the main blow to Putin is primarily psychological. Throughout the war that he started in February 22, this has all really been about describing the West and describing Ukraine as a hotbed of gangsterism and a sort of aggressive NATO. And he's used that as an excuse for this. Now here is now Ukraine conducting a counteroffensive onto Russian soil itself. He's always said that his war was a special operation to defend Russia, and here he's failed in his role of doing that. So there's a sort of psychological blow to Putin, which will mean his reaction to it is likely to be at the more extreme end of the scale. In the first instance, he'll probably aim to absorb the attack that's taking place, and then, as Francis pointed out, there'll be some kind of counter-offensive from there. And I think that's where the link comes in to the point about reinforcing and resupplying with ballistic missiles, because I think his intent will then be to try and deliver some blow to Ukraine, which is significant and, if you like, reflects the sort of psychological damage or the psychological injury that he feels he's had to what's happened now. You'll recall the previous psychological injury he had, which was the Prigozhin sort of attempted coup, and his response to that, which was dramatic and violent. And I think that's exactly what he'll try and do with the response to what Ukraine has done.
And in regard to Ukraine, now it's essentially an aggressor, an oppressor, I suppose, of Russian people, and that has changed the dynamic there. I just wonder, in regard to funding, NATO may have a view on that, I'm sure it will, and of course Britain has talked about the Storm Shadow missiles. I just wonder what your views are on the sort of shifting sands after such a long lionisation by the West of Zelensky.
I think that the challenge we've got is that in some respects, we've kind of held Zelensky back. So we were slow to resupply him with weapons. We've controlled which weapons he's received, and then we've controlled where he's going to use them. Throughout that entire time, Russia has continued to use all its weaponry, short of nuclear weapons, against Zelensky and the Ukrainian people from within sight in Russia. So we've kind of held them back. Now, what Zelensky's done now is he's effectively taken the war into Russia, and that puts us in a more difficult situation, because it was easy for us to say we're supporting a country who is defending themselves. When that defence, and I think it's still primarily an offensive in the context of a strategic defence, but it looks like an offence to invade another country. That puts us in a slightly more difficult position. It makes it harder for us to openly be supportive of what they're trying to do. Even though, as I said, overall, in terms of the balance, there's no question who the aggressor is. There's no question who's taken the largest portion of territory, not just from the war starting in February 22, but of course the fighting that started in 2014 that saw the siege of Crimea and also parts of Donbass and Luhansk. So that's there's a strategic picture, and then we've got this complicated operational picture, which has made it slightly perhaps more difficult for the West to be openly supportive of Zelensky. Now he's taken the war into Russia. But in the overall context, I think it's entirely justified.
Simon Diggins, Colonel Simon Diggins, Defence Security and Military Analyst, thank you for joining us on Times Radio.